So I have some amazing news. The Supreme Court just granted review to a new Second Amendment case, and it's aiming to strike down the ATF's current overreach and some of the rules that they put in place. So let's talk about what just happened. Now, real quick before we jump into this video, if you agree that the ATF needs to be abolished, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Now, before we jump into this video, I want to thank one of the new sponsors of the channel, which is Patriot Mobile. For 10 years, Patriot Mobile has been the only company in America, the only wireless provider that has Christian conservative values. Patriot Mobile offers dependable nationwide coverage, giving you the ability to access all three major networks. That means that the same coverage you would get from those companies is the exact same that you would get from Patriot Mobile. And you can also then support a company that has the same values as you, which is pro freedom of speech, pro 2A, and pro freedom. I first met Patriot Mobile over at SHOT Show. I met their whole marketing team. I got to have conversations with them, and they seemed like a really cool company. And they were actually sponsoring, SHOT Show, which is a big deal. And also, they are 100% based in the US, which means that if you need to call customer service, they're all here in the US, and I believe most of their team is actually in Texas. So I recommend that you guys check out Patriot Mobile if you're interested. You can go to patriotmobile.com/scholar, or you can call 972-PATRIOT. And if you use the code SCHOLAR, you can get a free activation fee. So again, really excited about this sponsor, a really cool company. They have the same values as us. And if you guys are interested, again, check out those links. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we have some great news coming out of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has now granted review in the ATF frames and receivers case called Vanderstock versus Garland. The case is now set to be heard and decided by the Supreme Court this year before the end of June. So before the end of their term, they will now rule in this case. This is a case where both the ATF and the pro-2A side wanted the Supreme Court to grant immediate review to this case, and the Supreme Court has responded by in fact granting review to this case, and that happened after they held conference last Friday. This Vanderstock case is the next major ATF overreach case that the Supreme Court will review and decide this year. That means that this year alone, we will receive two decisions coming out of the Supreme Court dealing with the ATF's Second Amendment violations and their restrictions, not just in the Cargill bump stock case, but now the Vanderstock versus Garland case, which deals with the ATF's rule on unfinished frames and receivers. This critical review is happening because the Fifth Circuit recently handed down its decision on the summary and final judgment of this case. A Fifth Circuit panel recently decided and partially upheld a lower court ruling and also vacated it partially because the Fifth Circuit believed a vacatur of the entire rule nationwide was beyond what the lower court could do and beyond that court's power. The ATF is hoping that the recent 5-4 emergency stays that were issued by the Supreme Court in this case that were in their favor will ultimately mean that the Supreme Court will rule favorably in their decision and, in favor of the ATF on a final merits review. But in my opinion, that's a huge mistake that the ATF is making to just assume that the stay orders and the emergency orders will mean that there will be a final merits decision also in their favor. Now, to understand what's at stake in this case and why the Supreme Court's hands were forced to take review of this case, we have to talk about what happened prior in this lawsuit and what has now been developed for Supreme Court review. Originally, this case and the original plaintiffs, FBC and Tactical Machining and Second Amendment Foundation, sought preliminary injunctions to halt the enforcement of the ATF's new rule against unfinished frames and receivers. They wanted a preliminary injunction to be put in place while this case was making its way through the process. On review, the lower court Judge Reed O'Connor granted a limited preliminary injunction against the ATF, which prevented the ATF from enforcing the rule against Tactical Machining and its customers. Now, after that, there were other companies like Blackhawk Manufacturing Group, also known as 80% Arms, and a bunch of other companies that joined the case as intervener plaintiffs and received preliminary injunctions to protect their companies and customers as well. Now, after the preliminary injunction stage, the plaintiffs then sought to win the entire case, and they filed for a motion for summary judgment. And in response, Judge O'Connor did grant the motion for summary judgment in favor of the pro-2A side and ultimately vacated the frames and receivers rule entirely, and that was a nationwide vacatur of the rule. That was a huge win because the entire rule was struck down nationwide. But of course, the ATF did not like that, so they filed an appeal up to the Fifth Circuit. Now, when they filed that appeal up to the Fifth Circuit, they also sought an emergency stay, both from the lower court judge and the Fifth Circuit, but both were denied. That then led the ATF to go to the Supreme Court on an emergency basis for the stay order for the first time in this case. They asked the Supreme Court to issue an emergency stay which would prevent that nationwide vacatur that was issued by Judge O'Connor from going into full effect. And in a 5-4 emergency order, the Supreme Court agreed to stay the enforcement of that summary judgment decision, which vacated the rule nationwide. Now, in that 5-4 stay order, it was Justice Barrett and Roberts who joined the liberals to decide in the ATF's favor. Now, after the Supreme Court issued that 5-4 order, 80% arms and defense distributed went back down to the lower court judge, Judge O'Connor, and sought an emergency motion to put back in place the limited preliminary injunctions. They asked for Judge O'Connor to put those back in place simply to protect their company and customers while the Fifth Circuit appeal was taking place. Essentially, they argued that Supreme Court's emergency stay only prevented a nationwide vacatur of the rule, but that Judge O'Connor could put back in place that limited injunction that was in place prior. On review, Judge O'Connor agreed, and ultimately also the Fifth Circuit agreed. Now, after the ATF lost that preliminary injunction that was put back in place at the lower court, and then they also lost once again at the Fifth Circuit level, they went crying up to the Supreme Court for the second time on an emergency basis, asking for those limited preliminary injunctions to be removed. And again, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the ATF's favor, removing also those limited preliminary injunctions. So that means for the second time, the Supreme Court sided with the ATF and struck down even the limited injunction. So the Supreme Court prevented any positive relief in this case while the summary judgment review was happening at the Fifth Circuit level. Now, again, like I said, the merits review was happening at the Fifth Circuit level still, and the Fifth Circuit recently did decide on the merits of the case, and in their decision, the panel partially upheld that lower court decision from Judge O'Connor, which struck down that ATF rule. That decision by the Fifth Circuit 3-judge panel agreed with the lower court Judge O'Connor that the rule was in fact facially invalid. However, the Fifth Circuit panel stated that they believed the outright vacatur of the rule, the type of relief that Judge O'Connor granted in this case, was too broad beyond his powers and kind of swept too broadly. Therefore, even though they said, we agree that this is facially invalid, we're going to remand this case back down to you, Judge O'Connor, for you to re-review the case and redecide the scope of relief that needs to be granted because a nationwide vacatur goes too far. Now, really, a lot of that has to do with the fact the Supreme Court had already stepped in twice in this case, had already stayed a nationwide vacatur of the rule, had even stayed the limited preliminary injunction. So it was signaling the Supreme Court did not like this broader scope of relief that was granted in this case. So I think the Fifth Circuit 3-judge panel was a little bit worried about that, did not want to defy what the Supreme Court said. So they said, we agree that this rule goes too far, it's overbroad, and we're just going to send it back down to the lower court for the scope of relief to be redecided. But really, after that decision, it was still a huge win because it was a review of a summary judgment. It went in our favor and the ATF rule was struck down. But after that, the ATF only had a few options. They could take the case en banc and they could try to litigate that in front of the Fifth Circuit en banc panel. But the Fifth Circuit en banc panel has not been their fans. They have not been in the ATF's favor. They've struck down multiple ATF rules already, including the Cargill bump stock case. And they could also just simply take the case back down to Judge O'Connor and relitigate, but ultimately all that was going to be was a decision on the scope of relief. I predicted that the ATF would ultimately be forced to take this case to the Supreme Court immediately, and that's exactly what they did. FPC and SEF and the plaintiff in this case filed their response to that petition, and they agreed that the Supreme Court should grant immediate review to this case. All of the parties agreed that nothing else could really develop in this case outside of the Supreme Court, and that's really because, like I've mentioned in prior videos, the emergency orders that the Supreme Court issued, which put a block on nationwide vacatures, which put a block on even limited injunctions, really means that the scope of relief is kind of, held right now. No court can really issue any true form of relief until the Supreme Court steps in this case and does something. Now, in my last video, I mentioned that this case went to Supreme Court conference last Friday, and we're waiting to see what the Supreme Court order list said as far as the Supreme Court granting review or denying review. Well, we got news today that the Supreme Court has in fact granted cert. They're going to review this case, which is big news. Now we have a second ATF case, a second ATF overreach case that will be reviewed and decided by the Supreme Court this year. That means that over the next few months, we will see the additional briefs filed by the parties, including a ton of amicus briefs. This is a case that is now going to go forward at a rapid pace. We're going to see a lot of briefs, a lot of arguments being held, a lot of things moving very fast in this case because essentially, Supreme Court has to decide this case before the end of June, which is the end of their term. So with just a few months left in their term, they have granted review to this case. There's going to be a ton of briefs filed. Oral arguments will be set probably here within the next few weeks. We will get news about the oral arguments when that's going to be set. And then again, briefs and all that will be established. And then the Supreme Court will need to decide this case before the end of the term. And so it could be late June into early July. Of course, when we get that information, I will let you guys know. And of course, we will be listening to the arguments to see what the Supreme Court's position is in regards to this specific ATF rule. So major developments and great news for the two-way movement. The Supreme Court has granted review to the new ATF overreach case, which is the Vanderstock versus Garland case dealing with the unfinished frames and receivers rule. Hopefully, we will get something positive coming out of this decision. And as we get more information, I will let you guys know. So if you guys like this video, and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm, and it signals to YouTube that you guys see value in these videos and in this type of two-way news. But as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.